The Across the Aisle podcast is brought to you by the University of Canberra to provide informed bipartisan commentary on the 2025 Australian federal election across the aisle. It brings insights and observations from two political veterans from different sides of Australian politics, as well as from their invited guests. David Feeney and University of Canberra adjunct Professor Scott Ryan both got involved in politics at university for the Labor Party and Liberal Party respectively. Scott went on to work for the Institute for Public Affairs and pharmaceutical company GlaxoSmithKline and was elected to the Australian Senate in 2007. He held various positions in the Abbott and Turnbull ministries and was president of the Senate for 4 years until in 2021 he was appointed Australia's High Commissioner to Canada. In 2024, Scott and his family returned to Australia and settled in Canberra. David Feeney has held multiple positions in the ALP, including as a campaign director, and was elected to the Australian Senate in 2007. He served as Parliamentary Secretary for Defence in the Gillard and Second Rudd ministries. In 2013, David moved to the House of Representatives, winning the Victorian seat of Batman. He left politics in 2018 when found to be a dual citizen by the High Court. Since then, David has worked in the defence and strategic policy sector based in Melbourne, where he lives with his family. Now let's join David and Scott's conversation across the aisle.
Welcome to Across the Aisle. I'm David Feeney.
And I'm Scott Ryan.
So we'll begin by talking about the 21 May 2022 federal election and setting the scene. Because, Scott, of course, that was the election that saw the election of the Albanese government. And, of course, it's how that government has gone about the business of governing, how it's managed Australian politics that sets it up for this election.
A lot has happened in that 3 years, just as a lot happened arguably in the previous 3 years with COVID.
Yes, well, that 2022 election really did see some new developments in Australian politics, some things we'd not seen before. And one of those was the rise of the Teals. For the first time, we saw the election of Teals in what had previously been regarded as blue ribbon Liberal Party seats.
And I think that's a defining feature of that election. I think we do need to see it in its historic context, though, which is that there had been a substantial rise in, let's call it, the independent third party or non-major party vote now happening over several decades. And I do remember 1990 when Ted Mack got elected to the seat of North Sydney. He was the first independent elected in decades. But since then, we've actually had quite a few. Now, there were some unique elements of the Teal vote I think we can explore, but we had Peter Andren, we then had, of course, Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott in 2010 and prior, supporting the Labor government at the time. So it was almost like another step up in that movement away from the two major parties, albeit I think on this occasion there was obviously a specific reflection on the Liberal Party, given the seats that were involved were traditionally what people used to call safe seats.
Yeah, I really feel like the Teals profited from three particular phenomena that were influential in the 2022 election, and they were a sense that women were being ignored and had been particularly badly treated, most spectacularly, of course, in the Parliament, but beyond that the Liberal Party had not responded to climate change and that was an issue of real importance to those particular high education, high income inner city voters. And I think a genuine antipathy towards Morrison and what we now call the Morrison government. Because, of course, he managed to give himself a few secret portfolios. And so I think what's interesting for me, those three factors sort of propelled a whole bunch of Teals into the Parliament over the top of long-standing Liberal Party machines and their electorates. But are those factors still alive? Are we going to see the Teal tide retreat?
And I think, again, this is where what led to the Teals is important. The Liberal Party vote amongst educated groups, which had traditionally decades ago been a supporter of the right of centre of politics, had been declining for many years. There had been a gender gap in politics in Australia,
Yeah.
with women increasingly supporting Labor. Although, again, if you go back right through the 40s, right through to the early 80s, women were supporters of the Liberal Party, and there was a gender gap the other way.
Yeah, in fact, very dramatically when the Liberal Party was founded, I recall.
Yeah, and so then we get to what happened in 2022 with the Teals. And remember, there was a pre-Teal with Zali Steggall and beating Tony Abbott in 2019 in Warringah. So I tend to try and see this as the end point, or one step in a longer pattern that had been underway. Those two factors about education level and gender gap, definitely. The issues you mentioned, they were clearly drivers of part of it. But if you look at the maths of a seat like Kooyong, Kooyong had fallen from a margin of the low teens, 30 years ago, to really only be a 7 or 8% seat. And in fact, I think after the 2004 election, the seat of Aston had a larger margin than the seat of Kooyong or Higgins, reflecting the changing voting patterns. And what happened was what has been seen elsewhere in particularly rural seats, with Tony Windsor, with Cathy McGowan in Victoria, which was the non-coalition vote consolidated very quickly behind the person who was perceived to be able to beat the coalition candidate, whether that be Liberal or National in the country, or in this case, a Liberal candidate in the city. They were resourced, I think, to a degree we probably had never seen minor party candidates resourced with the Climate 200 funding, and I'm not judging that, but I think we can accept that it was a significant amount of money in seats like Kooyong that third party candidates hadn't had before. And then essentially what happened was you had between 1 in 5 and 1 in 10 Liberal voters change column, because they weren't big victories. They were big victories in the sense that there were a lot of them, and the seats that were lost were very symbolic for the reasons you mentioned. But Josh Frydenberg lost Kooyong by under 3%. What happened was that 1 in 6, 1 in 7 Liberal voters, important that is, switched sides and joined the consolidated non-Liberal vote that was previously Labor or Green or Independent, who all mobilised with a highly organised campaign behind Monique Ryan. So it was partly a reflection of those issues. It was also partly a reflection of the weakness of the Liberal primary vote. And I think in Melbourne, because historically it has been a difficult hunting ground for the Liberal Party in recent decades, there was a Melbourne element to the Goldstein and Kooyong results as well.
Well, and remember too, the Great Australian Labor Party is not immune from this phenomena, although it takes different form, and that's the challenge of the Greens, where the alliance between the progressive middle class and the working class is kind of under ever greater pressure from the challenge of progressive Green voters. And whereas, on one side of the river, those sorts of voters are voting Teal, on the other side of the river, they're voting Green. And we've seen, Bant capturing the seat of Melbourne. That was a seat Labor had held for a century. Challenges in Wills and in my former seat of Batman. We do see well-resourced minor party campaigns challenging Labor's position in those electorates. And I think quite analogous to the story you just outlined, where suddenly Labor seats in the outer suburbs were much safer seats than, what we used to call federation seats. Labor had held its federation in the inner city. And that challenge is alive and well in this election as well as in 2022.
And I think that reflects that larger trend we've seen, David, when, I don't know what my first election I was involved in was 1990, albeit just handing out how-to-vote cards. And back then, the major parties got well over 80% of the vote. You go back to the election Bob Hawke won in 83, the major parties got over 90% of the vote. We're now down at 70 and falling with a constant 3 to 4 decade trend. So I think we're going to see more and more of these non-traditional contests. Last time in 2022, I think it was a record with 27 seats that were not a coalition Labor contest for the last two candidates. And all expectations are, with the Teals, with the point you mentioned there, with the widening of the Greens net, with other parties coming in, that's probably going to increase at this election.
I think there are some broader currents at work here too when we look around the world, and that is that the left and right almost seem to be swapping constituencies, don't they? Where high education, high income voters, once the bedrock of a Conservative Party, are drifting left, and the low education, low income working class voters are drifting right. And that's not just happening here in Australia. We see that dramatically, of course, in the United States with the election of Trump, but we see that in the United Kingdom, Boris breaking the red wall in the northern parts of the UK, so on and so on. There does seem to be this transfer underway.
It's definitely that traditional alignment is breaking down. The data I've seen still shows a much lower correlation, but it's not sort of a straight switch. Overlaying that, you do have where people work, public or private sector. You do still have socioeconomic and wealth, a huge driver, as you recall, and we still have a public-private sector, workplace. So it's definitely more dynamic, and in some ways it has a different impact in Australia because of compulsory voting. And I've got to say, one of the things I learnt living overseas in a pretty comparable democracy like Canada for 3 years was it is hard to overestimate the difference and importance of compulsory voting in terms of ensuring all participation, legitimacy of results, and particularly when results are very, very close.
I completely agree. And I'm also reminded of the wonderful institution, the Australian Electoral Commission.
Absolutely.
Which, a lot of people would regard as interesting as watching paint dry. But the AEC has done a really profound job for Australia in keeping our election systems not only non-partisan, but seen to be non-partisan. It's seen to be independent. And so we don't have this lunatic scene where boundaries are drawn up by politicians for politicians. Every state has its own system of counting the votes. The AEC, together with, as you say, compulsory voting, have proven to be big stabilisers for our democracy.
And, we've got to, I think, reflect. We've sort of forgotten that the last 15 years has produced some very close elections. I mean, apart from, I think Menzies in 61 or 63, I always get the two mixed up. I think it was 61, where he won by one seat. Every other government from World War II until 2010 was pretty much a clear result. 2010, we had, the hung parliament, the independents deciding. 2013 was a clear result. 2016, again, was the Turnbull government returned with a one-seat absolute majority. 2019, a similar result. 2022, the government had a small majority and there was a large crossbench. So 4 of the 5 closest elections in the last 80 years have been in the last 15. And I think it is testament to our system, the AEC plus the systems we use, that there's never been a question of legitimacy over that. And long may that last.
Yeah, that's right. Our election's not going to the High Court, candidates not insisting that there's been fakery and cheating and so forth. Yeah, we have been blessed, although it's good management rather than good luck. So in this election that's upon us now, some interesting trends to look at, isn't there? There's the urban-regional divide. There's various divides between states, and then there's the issues we've touched on, isn't there? What's happening to different demographic groups as they slide in new directions in their voting intention. Where do you think the Liberal Party's going to go in terms of its support in the cities? This seems to be a particular challenge for it, at least at this moment, not perhaps historically.
The Liberal Party at the last election went significantly backwards in essentially urban Australia in our large cities. And given that 2/3 of our population live in the capitals, it's not tenable to not be more competitive there. I do think it's particularly important to reflect on my former home state of Victoria and the city of Melbourne, now being a Canberra resident. Our performance there at the last election reflected essentially a very long-term trend. And I looked at this. I was born in 1973. There have been 19 federal elections since. At only 4 occasions has the coalition beaten the Labor Party with a majority of seats or a majority of the two-party preferred vote out of those 19. And they were 1975, 1977, a while ago, and pretty strong results for the coalition, 1990 and 2004. Not even in...
So really the collapse of the Liberal Party correlates with your birth,
Yeah,
that's
clearly. Well, I was born in Queensland, so I'll let people reflect on that.
I always remember the Liberal Party referring to Victoria as the jewel in its crown. And this used to really annoy me. And I was adamant, and I remain adamant, that in fact the Liberal Party's results in Victoria were always spectacular because of the DLP, the Democratic Labor Party, which split the Labor vote and preferenced Liberal and meant winning for the Liberal Party here in Melbourne just got easy. And with the disappearance of the DLP and the consolidation of Victorian Labor as a centrist and effective force in government, the game completely changed. Or you might say changed back to normal.
Well, yeah, so before the Liberal Party was formed in 1944, the Victorian politics was incredibly unstable. I mean, the longest serving government at that time was a country party government kept in office by the Labor Party.
Yes, indeed.
And the Liberal Party actually split on a couple of occasions, and at one point the leader who was forced out of the leadership challenged the new leader with a new Liberal Party and beat him in his own seat. I mean, and it was before Henry Bolte in the 1950s. It was actually, you're quite right, it wasn't a happy hunting ground. But I think importantly, Victoria is the most highly urbanised state in the country, in the sense of, Melbourne dominates Victoria in a way that Brisbane does not dominate Queensland.
Sure.
Or Sydney does not dominate New South Wales. If you look at Ballarat, Bendigo, Geelong, that they are more like, in many ways economically, they have employment profiles that are much more similar to Melbourne than smaller towns that are spread through New South Wales, Queensland or Western Australia. And to go back to our earlier level, historically, just looking at the ABS stats, Victoria's had higher education attainment. More people have finished Year 12, more people have gone to university. And as that has changed in terms of its voting behaviour, you've seen that reflected in Victoria statistics. I mean, I was surprised that even in 2013, which was a very strong result for the Coalition, or none of the Howard victories, did the Coalition win a majority of the two-party preferred vote in Victoria.
Yeah. So on the 21st of May, 2022, Australia gets a brand new government. And if you remember on election night, the first thing the newly elected Prime Minister Anthony Albanese does is he launches The Voice and a commitment to a referenda around the Indigenous voice in Australia. And I think this was a profound moment. I don't know. I mean, newly elected Prime Ministers get to say what they like on their victory night. And I don't know to what extent he'd discussed this with his colleagues, but it did commit this new Labor government to a referenda, and it meant that the first 18 months, as it transpired, of this new government was transfixed by this issue. And, to cut a long story short, it ended in tears, didn't it?
Well, again, I was watching that from afar, but referenda usually end in tears. We're now, I think, at 8 out of 45 successes, and only one of those was contested. The others were insignificant in many ways to the average voter and the quality of services government delivered them and all the things that drive election results. But I have noticed a pattern, David, I've got to say, over decades that Labor Prime Ministers come to office and whether it's a rush of blood to their head, they tend to think they can rewrite the Constitution and it always ends in tears.
We dream big in Labor, Scott, we dream big.
Yeah, Whitlam did it in 73, 74 on a few occasions. I mean, Hawke tried 2 batches of referenda in 84 and 88, and they all were smashed. They didn't even really get close. And of course, until Kevin Rudd returned to the leadership in 2013, there was going to be a referendum on recognition of local government that was very strongly supported by the current Prime Minister when he was then the Minister, and Julia Gillard. And that was called off when the election was made a week earlier than was initially the case.
Thank goodness, I might say, but free editorial.
I have to admit, I appreciate the commitment of the Labor Party to that, but I think it represented a window that missed some other things as well, apart from the fact that I don't think there was ever any realistic prospect of the Coalition supporting that referendum.
I think that's a key point, though, because I am certain that for a lot of people in Labor, particularly in those early moments of the new government, they really thought they had Dutton and the opposition cornered and that Dutton would be obliged to fall in some way, shape or form to a yes vote. And when that sort of started to fall to pieces, that misapprehension fell to pieces at the end of 2022, they were surprised. I'm quite confident that there was a false sense of confidence around that. It was always plain to me that Dutton was going to sink the knife into it. But then, to add insult to injury, I don't think the yes case was clearly articulated, and I think the campaign infrastructure put around the yes case was amateurish and unfocused, and so it was kind of doomed at several levels.
So the other thing I've noticed with referenda and over many years is that the process of getting something to a referendum, particularly because most of them have been put up by the Labor Party. The Liberal Party has not been a constitutional rewriter, partly because of the way the Constitution was written itself in the 1890s, before the Labor Party really came into its modern form, is that the referendum process tends to be everyone who agrees that there needs to be change has a long discussion and then proposes a change, and they haven't really engaged with people that have a different view until it goes to the voters. And I think that happened with this. I was inside the ministry for some of these discussions, and there are, I appreciate, very different views, but there is a principled view that one can oppose the voice on a principle, disregarding the politics. And there were a lot of Liberals that had that view, and a lot of Nationals that had that view. So because referenda tend to get to the point where they engage with people with a different view once the referendum starts and it's too late to make any changes, there were, sort of pleas from people like Greg Craven to try and, address the terms of the referendum. I actually don't think that would have made a big issue, because I still think the principled opposition that some Liberals and Nationals had meant that the very best case scenario for the government was a neutral formal position with lots of Liberals campaigning against it anyway, which is sort of what was going to happen with the local government referendum, because a lot of Liberals wanted to oppose it, but the leadership wanted to support it. So regardless of sort of what the campaign was, I think there are structural issues that meant that there was always going to be a bigger contest, and referenda tend to, and this was a more deliberative consultative process than most referenda have ever been through, I appreciate, but they tend to confront those with a different view at the end of the process rather than the start.
But it meant that for 18 months, the government was distracted on an issue which ultimately ended in a 60-40 no vote across the country, without the yes vote winning any state. And at the end of that, the Albanese government kind of had to pick up the pieces and persuade the people of Australia that it had a continuing reason for existence and a mission, didn't it? And so the voice really turned into an enormous, well, not simply a distraction. It sort of branded the government in a way that in the middle of its first term left it foundering, didn't it?
And I think all around the world, it is clear that we had forgotten what a political burden inflation was. So, right through the US, it was a big element in Trump's campaign and his victory over Kamala Harris. It's been a big issue in the UK and Canada, everywhere. The cost of living, which the economists call inflation, we really hadn't had it in our economies since the early 1990s. And I think a lot of people forgot about it. Households forgot about it until they saw their bills at the supermarket constantly going up. And whether that be in energy prices, obviously that's one thing that's been a really key focus of political debate here over several years now. But I also think governments forgot about it. And I think policymakers forgot about it. And they forgot how angry it makes people, which supercharges all that concern you raised there about the Labor government being focused on another issue, while at the same time citizens, households, small businesses, big businesses were all feeling, no, the biggest issue in my life is inflation. Everything is getting more expensive.
Yeah, and so sort of halfway through its first term, the Labor government finds that it's got an enormous amount of pressure upon it to have a strong economic strategy and an economic story for the Australian people who are under this stress, as you say. And, I think it's fair to say that economic policy is usually regarded as a brand strength for your side of politics more than mine. So it's trying to rebuild its credentials after the voice on what might be regarded as enemy policy terrain. But it does produce two surpluses, Scott.
It does. And it's interesting, though. I'd say one of the big changes that's happened over the last several decades, and I reflect on this partly because of when I started in politics, is that the surplus debt equation, which was defining in the 1990s, whether it was in Victoria, whether you're Jeff Kennett. One of the things I remember, Labor premiers who came to office all through the 2000s made it a commitment they were going to be financially responsible, and that was expressed through a balanced budget.
Yes. Well, I worked for Premier Brax through a time, of course. We were, as you say, obsessed by it.
And I'm not sure that the surplus, and the converse being the level of debt, has the same political currency it did 20 or 30 years ago. Now, that worries me with someone with my particular outlook, but I'm not sure if it has the same currency. I do think one of the things it has done, as the focus has come back onto the economy, is that it has given the platform back to Jim Chalmers. And, I think he is clearly one of the government's better communicators.
Yeah.
And he tells a story. And having him as the focus, I think, more helpful to the government's cause, simply by nature of his political skills and the way he talks about it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think he's been very, very effective. And I think you made a key point there, and that is he's a storyteller. And the government has lacked that, I feel. Someone who can describe complex policy in a way that is a story for interested listeners and sort of pulls threads together into a narrative. And that's such an important skill in politics. And I guess reflecting on the Albanese's first term in office, the first of many, I hope, I guess it seems to me that one of the big themes of the last 18 months has been how international distractions took centre stage and meant that post The Voice, the government never got the strategic initiative back. It was thereafter just responding. Well, this is how it felt. The invasion of Ukraine sort of transfixed the world and unsettled markets and became an important externality. And then the US elections, which just seemed to endlessly obsess Australians and the world, the Donald Trump, and then the war in Gaza, which broke out in October of 23. All of these things, they kind of landed into Australian politics and meant that whatever we were talking about, we weren't talking about things that Albanese and his government wanted us talking about, and we weren't talking about things set by them. They were rolling with the punches just like everybody else.
It's like, the apocryphal or true, I don't know, Harold Macmillan comment, events, dear boy, events.
Yes.
Is describing, life in politics. I think that's true. I think it's also broadly true of the era we're in. I mean, in my experience, there aren't many places in the world where the Prime Minister of a country or the leader of the opposition of a country the size of ours can do an interview and be expected to answer almost any question on any topic that might have popped up on social media or might have just appeared in the online media within hours. That's an Australian a trait. I don't mind it. I just think it's an important observation.
And any minister can be asked about any portfolio.
Exactly. I do think the government tried to use some of these things to its advantage in the sense that it tried to link the breaking of the electricity price commitment and high energy prices to Ukraine. So I do think it tried to, but to at least tell that as a story, and that became part of the political contest. International issues have got a significant role, and what is happening internationally during the campaign is likely to have an impact on our election. I mean, Liberation Day last Thursday and Donald Trump's unilateral tariff announcements for one. I can't think of another example where a foreign leader or a US president has made announcements in the middle of a campaign that everyone's sort of holding their breath for, and the reaction to it is a critical element of that domestic campaign. I like to say that it's almost like there are three leaders in this campaign. You've got Anthony Albanese, you've got Peter Dutton, and you've got Donald Trump.
God help us.
When you look at the public data on recognition of leaders, I think Donald Trump would probably be up there with either of the Prime Minister or leader of the opposition, if not higher.
Yeah, but if you're Prime Minister Albanese and you're trying to get re-elected, and Dutton too for that matter, you've just got this giant Catherine wheel of uncertainty zooming through your political landscape where the whole conversation can be taken off in a different direction. And to some extent, I feel like US elections have been doing that to Australian politics now for many, many months. And I mean, it'd be interesting to find out if the famous debate between Trump and Biden ends up being a debate that was watched by more Australians than the debates we're about to have here in Australia. But then what all of these things do is, together with the economic stress, is just build a sense of insecurity around Australian families and Australian voters. The world is turning to SHIT. The Defence Department keeps telling us these are dangerous times. There's proof of that on our television screens.
And there's proof of it in the streets. One of the striking things, both from afar and upon returning, again, just because it's similar to the experience of where I was when I was living in Canada, the scale of what were weekly protests on the streets of Melbourne, up and down Bourke Street. And that's not something that I think Australians are used to happening so intensely, like the occasional protest about the issue of the day. If you live in inner Melbourne, you sort of get used to the Route 96 tram being delayed on Saturdays and Sundays as the protesters outside State Parliament.
They all make their way back to Northcote where I live afterwards, so it gets easier on the way home.
But they, but I think the intensity of that has surprised Australians and reinforced the point that you made, that secretaries, ministers, prime ministers, opposition leaders, if there's one thing that the system of, at least across the major parties, has agreed with, which is that, we are cursed to live in interesting times, and that's not a positive. The international economic order was upended last Thursday to a degree that hasn't happened in decades, and it has been clear for a long time, both through the unprecedented sort of live fire exercise near flight paths between Australia and New Zealand, for one, that the international order on which our security and economic security was based is also under much, much greater threat and challenge. But you've now got this new factor happening where you've got the Senator Payman setting up the new party, and that's completely targeting what would be considered outer suburban, safer Labor seats, which is something where there's not a great presence of the Liberal Party.
No, that's true. And Senator Payman, of course, quit the Labor Party on the 4th of July 2024, having been elected to a Senate term of 6 years. So to quote my old friend Robert Ray, she's sitting in the Senate on stolen votes, having been elected as a Labor senator.
Look, we've had boons in breakaway parties before in the polls, and they then disappear in the privacy of a polling booth. I think for the good of our country, I hope we don't see a return to a modern form of sectarianism. It was one of the great curses of Australian politics for decades, and it disappeared almost overnight in the 60s and 70s, despite having been defining for decades before that, right from the World War I through to the Labor split in the 50s. And so it will be interesting to see what the results are on polling day. I would make the point that since the changes put through to the Senate voting system in 2016, it does dramatically reduce the ability of preference whisperers or preference dealers to create Senate spots effectively out of 1 or 2% of the vote. That's no longer there. So it is a return to a more traditional campaign where it has to have impact in a local seat. And I'll be honest, I don't know enough about those seats to know whether it is likely to.
Yeah, in my previous life as a Labor campaign director, I had some dealings with Glenn Drury, who's a very urbane and sophisticated operator. As you might expect, the media like to make him into a villain, and he's perhaps easy to villainise. But he knows his business, and he will construct a strategy for Senator Payman that he thinks gives her the best shot of being re-elected. I don't see how you get her re-elected in Western Australia myself.
No.
She's got years to prove me wrong. But it is another example, isn't it, of, the Labor senator leaves the Labor Party. There's lots of furore, lots of media interest in her. She gets her own set of stories. And the Labor Party, the Labor government is bounced off subject again. The government is bounced off message for another period of time as these things happen to it rather than come from it.
It definitely gets more attention than, Senator Gerard Rennick lost pre-selection with the LNP in Queensland and then went off and formed his own party, but doesn't seem to be getting the attention of Senator Payman. So, it's fair to say, I think, resonating both because of the cause, which attracts media attention, and the circumstances that led to it, have probably ensured that it attracts more attention. So
we end up on the eve of the 2025 election in this strange position, and I've got a quote here from Margaret Ledouc that I want to read. Why, in tough economic times, is stable and orderly government not enough? It is something we haven't seen for more than 10 years. Albanese's government has had no scandals, no rorting, no misusing taxpayers' money, no bonking of staff, no sackings, no backstabbings. Just well-behaved and competent ministers doing their jobs well. It's been a refreshing change from the 9 years of chaos and instability in which Dutton was a key player. End quote. But if all of that's true, why then do we see, in the months leading up to this election, the polling telling us that the numbers are closing, that Albanese's standing in the electorate is on the decline, and that a first-term Labor government faces the real prospect of defeat, or perhaps its best-case scenario, becoming a minority Labor government? How does this happen? And, as a Labor voter, I'm finding the whole thing very frustrating.
Well, I think there's two elements. I genuinely believe that what we saw over the last 2 decades in politics is instability in politics as a result of tensions in the community. I mean, if Anthony Albanese gets re-elected, he'll be the first Prime Minister since John Howard in 2001 and 2004 to be re-elected, which, when you think of it, is 2 decades. It's an extraordinary period of time.
Yeah, but the worm has turned, hasn't it? Someone said to me recently, this is the first parliament where the opposition leader at the start was the opposition leader at the end.
Absolutely.
And the Prime Minister at the start was the Prime Minister at the end. Stability is back in fashion now, isn't it?
Yes, and so I think what happened over that quote you read out, the tensions and chaos internally that we both witnessed over the last 20 years was partly a reflection of bigger ones in society as well as politics itself. And why is the government in trouble? Well, you know, from my perspective, you've got a situation where people are feeling economic pain. And, you know, when you look at all the statistics on housing stress, mortgage stress, the rise in the price of rents, the increase in interest rates, yes, they've come down, you know, but they went up 12, 13 times and came down once. There's a whole bunch of reasons why the electorate is grumpy. And the government, remember, is the first time a government came to office with a swing against it. It's just the swing against the outgoing government was bigger. We haven't had at the federal level a lot of first-term governments come to office so narrowly. It has happened at the state level, you know, with premiers right through the 90s and 2000s, Steve Bracks, Mike Rand, Peter Beattie, Bob Carr. But it hasn't happened federally. Traditionally, there's been a big swing in 2007, 1996.
Yeah.
So the government, I suppose, the opposition, the government of the day under Scott Morrison lost, but there wasn't a huge vote of confidence in the opposition when you look at the swing it got, because it actually went backwards on a primary vote.
But Albo did come home with a victory, and
Exactly.
It was a vindication of his small target strategy. Yep. But I guess what I anticipated, and I think many others did too, was that a small target opposition would then blossom in government into a full reformist and activist government, and its runs on the board would then secure it a significant re-election. A pattern that we've seen, I think, in some state Labor governments, for instance. But that's not what happened, is it? My own, and reflecting my bias, because I've worked and know well a lot of people in the government and the cabinet, my own view is that this cabinet is chock-a-block full of talent, and that Albo has been very successful at running a cabinet-style government and leaving them in their lanes to perform. But where it seems to have fallen down is their collective capacity to tell a story and to shape the issues agenda. So things are happening to it, and it's not. None of us are remembering its accomplishments. Like, what has it done? Cruel people used to say, "What is the point of the Albanese government?"
Well, I think a couple of things you mentioned there, David, leapt out at me. One of which is there are a lot of people, and there's been a lot of Labor success at the state level, and my view is when I look at the federal government, I actually see a lot of state Labor in their approach to politics. One of those has, quite frankly, to reflect on some of my former colleagues at the state level, has been an assumption that the coalition would disintegrate into internal disunity and opposition.
Well, that's what you meant to do, Scott.
And it's something that we've done more than once. I mean,
it was a key ingredient for the Hawk success.
And, you know, we had 3 leaders in my first 17 months in Parliament. You know, when we came in 2008 till December the 1st, so July 1 to 2008 till December the 1st, 2009, the Liberal Party had Brendan Nelson, Malcolm Turnbull and then Tony Abbott as leader. And so I do think that, especially if you go back to 2022, the assumption Dutton can't win, the historic loss of the Aston by-election, a really low point for the Liberal Party at that point, all before the Voice referendum in many ways, there was an assumption that Dutton can't win. And I have always been a big believer in never assume someone can't win. And so I do think the Labor Party coasted on that, and I do think that their state experience, and so many of them, and so many of the officials have come from a state level where they have seen that happen. And Peter Dutton has, in my view, been incredibly successful and uncommonly successful at having a united Liberal Party and a united coalition with very few breakouts. And then you add that, the external effect, the narrow government majority, and this was always going to be a competitive election with a competitive opposition.
Well, it certainly turned out that way. And as you say, Dutton has been very successful at keeping the show together. But another thing that strikes me is he has been significantly underestimated, hasn't he? And it reminds me a little bit of 1984, where Andrew Peacock nearly ran off with an election where he was completely underestimated. Australians don't need to love their leaders, they just need to respect them. And I feel like a lot of voters respect Dutton, even if they don't like him. It's very cool in the circles I move in to regard him as a Voldemort figure. But that Queensland cop, home affairs, hard on immigration stuff plays well with big or important audiences.
Look, I'll be blunt, Liberal leaders are never loved. John Howard's our second longest serving Prime Minister. He never got the approval ratings of Kevin Rudd. On the day of the 1996 election, Paul Keating was the preferred Prime Minister in the Age poll. Yet the election result was one of the biggest election landslides in Australian history.
Well, I recall Jeff Kennett was preferred Premier up until the moment he lost as well.
Yeah, and at the federal level, Liberals have never really been loved. And, John Howard used to say it, I'm paraphrasing, and I think Peter Dutton said something similar, I'd prefer to be respected than loved. I actually think what's more important is predictability. And when I remember looking at the research around John Howard, it wasn't what I'll call a value-laden element of respect. There was clearly some of that. But there was also a lot of predictability. And I do think Australian voters like predictability.
They like leaders with values too, don't they?
They do.
I don't like John Howard, but at least I know what he stands for. That was, a common refrain.
And that made him predictable. So you didn't wake up and get surprised. If the world is an unstable place, and we're seeing that with Donald Trump, we're seeing that with our region and China, then I do think predictability becomes a much more important virtue. Because when we've seen likeability high, and Kevin Rudd's the best example of this, it can drop away very quickly, as it could with Jeff Kennett, personal popularity. It's important to have, and you probably prefer to have it, but it's not defining in the same way that other attributes are.
Not something I've ever had to wrestle with myself.
Me either, but that's the beauty of the Senate, David. No one had to.
But I have this theory, right, which is that there's been a spectacular brain drain out of the federal Liberal Party. And since 2018, really, when a lot of senior Liberals thought time was up and they were going to lose the 2019 election, of course, as it turns out, they didn't, but a lot of them went into it thinking they would. A lot of the big names on the Liberal side, Abbott, Turnbull, Bishop, Frydenberg, Pyne, Sinodinos, Birmingham, Ryan. I'm sure there are lots of others I've forgotten. It's like there's been a significant brain drain, and from where I'm sitting, it's not obvious that they've been replaced. And so is Dutton working with an opposition that's really depleted?
Yeah, I call it renewal. A lot of those names are actually from the Howard era. You mentioned Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull, Julie Bishop, Christopher Pyne, Arthur Sinodinos, although in Parliament only later. They're actually from two governments ago. So I do think...
But they were ministers up until 3-4 years ago.
But I do think this is a challenge most oppositions have. I mean, in 2007, the same criticism was made of Kevin Rudd's shadow ministry. Shadow ministers just never have the profile of ministers. And as you'd remember from the research you saw, I'm sure, David, that even ministers don't have the profile they think they have amongst the public. The public actually recognise and know very few key players. So I just think it's the challenge of renewal. Where the Liberal Party still has a challenge is in addressing an issue we discussed right back at the start of this, which was defined and crystallised in many ways by the Teals, which is around the gender gap. And recent research in just came out over the weekend had the gender gap with women remaining. I think it was the Resolve material in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. But the gap had closed amongst men, so it just remained with women. So the coalition was that Labor had closed what was a male gender gap that they had. And that goes to pre-selections. The Liberal Party doesn't have an affirmative action program. I don't see how it could, but that has come at some political challenge where people, and I've had this asked of me myself when I was still in Parliament, why aren't you choosing more women as candidates in winnable seats?
Yeah, there's no doubt in my mind that affirmative action has been a very successful mechanism for the Australian Labor Party, and it's not something that's easy to do with single-member electorates.
Absolutely.
And it needs a lot of factional discipline, to be blunt. We can talk about factions eventually, but factions bring a lot of positive and negative attributes to the Labor Party, but one of the positive attributes is you can have, to a great extent, a lot of party management around issues like this, because I think affirmative action can become problematic when you're, depending on which groups you're talking about, but when you're talking about women, when you're talking about 51% of the population, you haven't disappeared into identity politics. You're really just setting the ship aright so that it sails better electorally. And I watched over the course of my career the ranks of the Labor Party transform, and I've no doubt it made us stronger, which leads me to think that the Liberal Party really needs to embrace affirmative action, but you won't.
There's almost no mechanism to do it, David. I mean, I just go back to my former home state of Victoria. There was no mechanism to actually install people the way the Labor Party federal executive or state executive could. I'm not going to say that there are no factions in the Liberal Party, but they're much looser tendencies than strictly voting blocks that have their own caucuses, like in the Labor Party. And I know in New South Wales, at the last state election, for example, there was a state executive determination to install several women onto the Upper House Legislative Council ticket, which they could do because they couldn't override local pre-selections. And that caused quite a bit of tension inside the party, although it did dramatically increase the number of women as a member of the Liberal Party room. It's partly, if you, as the Liberal Party aspires to, and we aspired to when I wrote the rules a few years ago with others, local democracy being the choice of candidate, then it's hard to find the mechanisms to override that. And that is an ongoing challenge.
The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, don't they? I mean, this is where the collective culture of the Labor Party helped it manage this challenge.
Yeah, the individual nature of the Liberal Party means we don't have those mechanisms that the Labor Party has. And so it's a matter of, I think Jane Hume referred to this, it's a matter of developing candidates and supporting candidates in a different way than the Labor Party does, which can then install candidates.
So to sort of advance my pet theory a little further, I think Dutton has enjoyed a period of strong message discipline, which in some ways has been him making a virtue out of necessity because he hasn't had the team of shadow ministers around him to delegate media to. And so if there's only one person who can be trusted to perform, it looks like message discipline, but it might just be that he's one of the few people in the show that can perform.
Although I do remember, the lead up to 2013, the 2010 to 2013 period, which was pretty volatile, and Tony Abbott did do a lot of media. There was that relentless going out to factories and people about the carbon tax. In opposition, I've always thought that there's a unique burden on the leader on media, and you don't see that many other shadows except around the budget. You'll see the shadow treasurer and finance minister, and when there's a major government initiative, it does tend to be opposition leader driven.
No, that's true. But are they in the background, Scott, doing the policy work in opposition? I mean, are there Liberal Party Jedi Knights that haven't been revealed to the public yet, but who are roaming the corridors of Parliament House preparing the Liberal Party for government?
I can only imagine what some party rooms might have been if everyone had lightsabers, David. That would have been...
I wouldn't have fared very well.
No, me either. Look, and this is what we're going to find out over the coming weeks. Peter Dutton has flagged that there are significant announcements to come during the campaign. I do think, regardless of what people think of the policy, that the nuclear policy was a particularly courageous move for an opposition to adopt and was well researched. I know there's contest and argument over various things, but it was a particularly significant piece of policy work and a particularly significant decision by the coalition to announce that, a year before a campaign, give the government time to attack it. So if there's work that matches that coming over the next couple of weeks, as the opposition's flagged, then the election will still be very competitive. But I do think there's now, particularly with what's happened in the first week of the campaign, an expectation that the coalition will be making some announcements on the economy, on cost of living, on those bread and butter issues in the coming days and week.
Yeah, I knew the coalition was deadly serious about nuclear energy when they announced where the reactors would be. When people have had this policy dalliance before, but they've never nominated where the reactors would go for fear of the local reaction. when the coalition took that step, I thought, well, hello, this is deadly serious.
And there's a bit of history to that. It won't surprise you to know it's popped up in the coalition party room every so often. You know, you can go back and track people's op-eds that we should consider nuclear, right back to the 2000s before I came in. And it was sometimes, you know, a member with an urban seat, and you'd then have, you know, a few interjections from the back of the party room saying, well, let's put it in insert suburb. I won't use names. We're going to put it next to so-and-so school. And that sort of still killed the debate at that point.
As you say, that it was quite a dramatic policy, but it hasn't had a dramatic impact on our politics, has it?
Less so, yeah.
I mean, people are not marching in the streets saying no nuclear.
Which I have to admit, all the data I saw after it was announced and just reading the newspapers, I was surprised that there wasn't more opposition and that it was such a closely contested issue and that younger Australians in particular are much, much more open to it. I think that just reflects my age and, you know, remembering Peter Garrett leading NDP marches.
Yeah, exactly.
And that it's very much a product of the 70s and 80s, you know, the opposition to nuclear. And so that surprised me. It hasn't redefined our politics in the way that I think if it was done 15 or 20 years ago, it still would have provoked all those 70s and 80s people who had strong opposition to it.
It made me wonder whether the sort of bipartisan decision to pursue nuclear propulsion for our submarine forces kind of ended up opening a door, and the whole country's passed through it without much of a backward glance. I mean, you know, we might see there are several weeks to run of this election campaign. Perhaps we'll see it, but I think that's a surprising aspect. Christopher Pyne wrote, and I'm sure you saw this, an article some weeks ago where he suggested that the coalition had adopted the nuclear policy really as an artifice to hide their internal differences over coal versus climate change. Do you think and of course he made the point, which I'm sure your side of politics did not welcome, that that the Liberal Party wasn't serious about nuclear energy. It was just a way of shutting everybody up on the broader climate. Do you let that hold any water?
You know, if any single issue, you know, I think triggers former Liberal and Coalition Party room members as the catalyst for so many of the internal divisions over the last 20 years, it's climate change. I don't see the rationale for what Christopher said there, mainly because you wouldn't open up a front this big for an internal issue. I mean, the coalition has very different costings than Labor, but Labor's out there saying $600 billion. It has given the government something to work with and to attack the coalition for. So I don't think you'd open the door on an issue this big purely for internal issues.
So we come to the starting line of the election with the Dutton opposition looking in good repair. Immigration's been working for them. Law and order's been working for them. They won the no vote. Alvo's standing doesn't seem to have, it seems to be on the decline rather than on the ascendancy. And the election is launched. Everyone's expecting it now to be a very, very close election. Everyone's thinking the campaign will be decisive in deciding who wins.
And I think you don't want to be that person that makes the first big mistake, whether you're a minister, a shadow minister or whatever, because that could be defining for what is still, when you look at both sides' vote, particularly Labor vote that I've seen in the research, there's still a softness to its vote, and there's always a whole bunch of people who are going to be making up their minds in the last days and hours. And when you're looking at, you know, the government having a one-seat majority, although Peter Dutton has a big mountain to climb, you know, 18 seats to get to majority, probably 14 to get to a negotiating position, you'd still say that, you know, Labor's in the box seat. They're the incumbent and they need to hold rather than win a lot, whereas the opposition needs to get quite a substantial swing of, 3% to get to a negotiating position and 5% to get to a majority.
That's true, but from the Labor corner, it all looked very scary. The primary vote was in the 20s, which is just ghastly. When the race started, it was in the 20s. And we didn't seem to have any momentum. But I think that changed because the campaign, and I take my hat off here to the federal government, I thought they launched the campaign on the back of a budget. And I thought they executed that week really well, because They launched the budget. They managed $17 billion in tax cuts. Came as a surprise. No one had seen that coming. And Dutton's decision to oppose those tax cuts gave the government a key line, which is how can you trust him to worry about your cost of living when he's proposing a tax cut? And in some ways, covered the fact or made up for the fact that the budget was back in deficit. The government, nonetheless, was on the front foot economically, and Dutton's response was a fuel excise suspension. So do you agree with that? Or do you think Labor kind of launched itself out of the starting block about as cleverly as it could have?
I think the inadvertent delay in the start of the election campaign, the unintended delay, because it was clearly meant to happen without the budget, caused by the cyclone and storm in Sydney, has probably been allowed the government to do as you outlined. It did execute that week relatively well, and it was probably surprised as much as anything by the opposition's opposing of the tax cuts and competing fuel excise cut. But I think that extra time has given, if anything, unintentionally, the Labor Party, after a difficult summer, seems to have got into more of a groove.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you call an election when you think you can win it, and so Labor was hanging on into May, waiting for the tide to turn. I wonder if the tide has turned. So this election is going to be a deeply fascinating one. Will the trends we saw in 2022 survive the 2025 election? Will we continue to see Labor build momentum over the course of this campaign? Scott, what do you reckon?
Well, over the first week, you'd say Labor, like you said, it's built momentum. It's clawed a couple of points back. All the commentary, while that doesn't necessarily have a sway on the voters, is very much looking at the opposition to see what they do over the coming week, to see if they can have a significant announcement to claw it back. It's still close, but it'll be an interesting second week to see if the seeming success of Labor in the first week to improve their position continues or otherwise.
And we'll see whether the opposition has used its time in opposition to do its homework.
And we'll see how any announcements go. And as, of course, the ever-present third leader in our campaign, Donald Trump. See what he gets up to this week.
Goodness me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
David and Scott are following the campaign over coming weeks and will return weekly with further informed analysis and opinion right up to Election Day on the 3rd of May. So save this podcast to your favourites and be sure to join Across the Aisle again next week, brought to you by the University of Canberra with production by the Faculty of Arts and Design.